Okay, everybody, this is Sheets, and I don't know quite what I'm going to call this. I was going to call it Jimmy Valvano, for out of tribute to the former NC State coach for his famous "Don't give up, don't ever give up" speech. Um, but I think that Jimmy Valvano's plight and his life is much more important than this, so I wouldn't want to belittle it. And yet, I'm going to call it that anyway. The reason why I think of this is because, sometimes things don't go the way we like, and we lose a race, we lose a big pot, whatever it is, and we're stuck with a very short stack. Um, Sometimes we shove and we get called by someone who is shorter than we are by a small amount, and we do have to figure out how to deal with situations like this. Now, there was a post in the PXF forums, which have been getting a lot more activity recently, which I like, by one of our subscribers who is basically just thinking about situations where it would be correct to shove any two cards. And slowly but surely, the thread kind of developed into this discussion over a particular situation. And that situation is when you were under the gun with five big blinds. And it's not really an accident that that particular situation came up, because it is a situation that has been talked about quite a bit. I mean, even back 5, 6 years ago, I remember Daryl, Dick and Gigabet would tell me that you should always shove under the gun when you have five big blinds. The idea is, among other things, is that you're running out of fold equity. You might as well take advantage of it while you can, and things of that nature. Now, one thing about the post from which this was derived that we're not going to consider, but it is something to think about in the back of your mind, is the post suggested that not only are you shoving five big blinds, but the amount of the big blind was going to go up the next hand. Now, we're not going to consider that for the purposes of this analysis, but when we get through the analysis, you'll see that it really doesn't make that much of a difference anyway. Now, before you even discuss how to attack this, instinctively, you would think that you'd want to shove pretty liberally here, right? Because, the big blind's coming, and if you don't shove now, you're going to have to pay 200 the next hand, and then you're going to be in a world of trouble. That's how you think of it instinctively. How do you kind of really analyze it mathematically? Well, the first thing that I would probably want to do is pull up the charts, right? Go to the trouble of making them. So this kind of M of 2 situation, right? There's 525 in the middle. You have about 1,000. So I'd pull up the chart, and it would show M of 2. You're going to shove that pretty tight, actually. Not that wide. Not as wide as you would think, right? Although this is actually pretty wide. It's wider than you think also. Um, so is that enough? No. And I'm going to tell you why. See, the charts, and as I've described in my videos about the charts have some very, very important limitations to them. One of which is brought up here. One of them is the fact that when you look at the charts presume that everybody has the same M. I mean, when we analyze M of 2 shove, we're presuming everybody has the same chip stack. And common sense will tell you that, number one, that doesn't happen all the time, if ever. And the other thing common sense will tell you is, if you're the one with the M of 2 and everybody else has a carload of chips, well, they're going to be calling you much lighter than if they had the same stack as you. So as a result, you'd probably have to tighten up a little bit. Okay? So that's one thing that the charts don't take into consideration, which is a very severe limitation that we have to kind of address when we do this analysis. Now, the other thing that the charts do not address, which we can't talk about quantitatively, is the loss of fold equity. In other words, if you fold here and then go through the blinds, not only do you lose chips, but you've lost your fold equity. You're not going to be able to shove without a showdown for forever, right? You'll have to get a showdown eventually. And that is something, unfortunately, we cannot analyze quantitatively. So we have to kind of just make some common sense addition for that later. But what I do want to do is make some assumptions, go through the analysis and go through some math here, and then kind of compare two ways of looking at it that come up with kind of different results. Now, the first thing that we have to do a situation like this, I mean, if we're going to figure out whether someone's going to call or not, you need your good old poker stove, right? You have to, if you're going to put ranges in, you have to come up with poker stove and know how to use it. Okay, so we have poker stove ready to go. The other thing we kind of need is the is some worksheet. So we have, so here's a spreadsheet which I created, um, which I am going to refer to, and I'm going to go through where all these numbers come from. Okay, it's going to be a little bit arcane, but it is worth it. We'll go through it once. We don't have to do it again. I got to pause you for just a sec. Sorry about that. So in yellow are the things that we input, and the things that are not in yellow are the things that get calculated automatically. And I want to show you what all these things are. Now remember, we're talking about a situation where it's 1, 2 and a quarter. We have 1,000 chips. All right. So let's look at a couple of things. So we put 200 in the big blind. We put antes 25. It's 1, 2 and a quarter, and 9 players. We put a starting stack of 1,000. Now what that does, this multiplies automatically. We have total antes are now 225. Total in the pot pre-flop, that's what this really should mean. Total in the pot pre-flop is basically the blinds plus the antes. So that calculates automatically 525, which means you win 525 if you steal, okay? But again, we didn't need to put that in twice. Now here I put lose if fold 0. And we're going to get back to that in a second, because this presumes that if you lose, you start with 1,000. If you lose, by folding, you end up with 1,000. But as we'll see, that's not necessarily correct either. But let's do it this way first. Fold percentage. What this is the product of all of these call ranges. Now, what are these call ranges? The call ranges are basically ranges that we put in to Poker Stove based on our experience of playing poker to indicate what various positions we'll call a 5 big blind shove with. Now, I will tell you, I just did not make these ranges up. What I did was I went into 3 different chats with PXF members and took everybody's suggestions, took out the outliers, and basically these are the ranges we came up with. So what we did is we put them in Poker Stove. Like, for example, if the under the gun plus the under the gun shoves, we assume that, excuse me, if we shove, the under the gun plus 1 is going to call with 5.9% of the hands, which means 8s and up, ace queen and up, and ace jack suited. And that's what we agreed on. Now, the calling range is 5.9%, and you'll see in this I column, it says chance he calls. Well, isn't that the same thing? Well, for this position, it is. But for other positions, it isn't. And we'll get to that in a minute. If he needs to have the top 5.9% of the hands to call, he's going to call 5.9% of the time. So then what we did is we went to the next guy, the hijack plus 2, and asked what he's going to call with if you shove. Now, for the purposes of this, I asked, and nobody was willing to give him an extra hand. Well, some people were, but most people weren't. We felt as though under the gun plus 2 was pretty much the same. So we left it as the same range as 5.9%. But the chances that this guy is going to call is not 5.9%. Can you think why? The reason why is for this particular guy to call, well, the first guy's got to fold, right? So it's not just the S to have the top 5.9%, it's that it's got to be on him with the option to do so. So it's basically it's multiplying the chance that he folds times the 5.9%. So the chance this particular guy calls is 5.55. And the reason why we have to get a particular chance that each person calls is that we have to figure out for each person what your equity is, how much chips you win, if how many chips you win if you get called and win, how many if you lose, what's the net. So we have to figure out what everybody's actual chance of calling are. And so on. Hijack +1. We gave him some more hands. I think we gave him sevens, ace 10 suited, maybe ace jack. Yeah, to get 7.5. And so on and so forth. And we figured out the chance that he calls is, again, this times it's the chances that the 7.5% guy calls is the chance that hijack +3 folds times the chance that hijack +2 folds times the 7.5%, which equals 6.64, and so on and so forth. So we established these ranges for each person. And what we did was, I forget which hand we were analyzing, but we ran, it doesn't really matter. We ran the hand in Poker Stove against all these ranges, and we came up with the following equities, or so, okay, against these different calling ranges. So let's get back to this. Fold percentage is 29%, which means you multiply all these calling ranges by each other. That means that 29%, actually, you multiply the folding ranges times each other. You want the chance that he folds. So you multiply all these folds by each other, and you get about 30%. That means that 30% of the time, you're going to steal this pot pre-flop. So what that means is your win from the folds is going to be the amount of times they fold, about 30%, times the amount of money you win if you steal, right? So 525. So as you'll see, B8 times B5, right? 157 or so. Call percentage for you high-level math people, that's 1 minus your fold percentage. That means you're going to get called about 70% of the time. Now here, lose if you lose. You have 1,000 chips. Is there any way to lose more than 1,000? No. If you lose, okay? If there's any way to lose less than 1,000? No. So you lose, if you lose, is going to be 1,000. And that kind of populates all through, well, you won't even see it populate, but it's 1,000. Now, win if you win the hand. In other words, if you get called and win, it really depends on who calls you. See, your base is 1525, which means how much you have, it's 1,000, plus you get what's in the pot pre-flop. So the most you can win is 1525. But, you see over here, 1525, 1525, 1525. But if the big blind calls you, it's 200 less for him to call, so you can't win all of that. You can only win 1525 minus the 200. So that's 1325. And likewise, if the small blind calls you, then the most you can win is 1425. So, but this is the base from which you work. So here, now, loss from calls. In other words, if you do get called, that's 70% of the time, what do you rate to lose? We figured out your wins from your folds. Now we have to figure out what happens if you get called. So you have to figure it out for each person. First, your wins. First, you have to add up how much you win when you win the hands. So here, from wins, how do you do this? Well, you multiply the amount of money you win, the amount of chips you win if you win the showdown, times the equity you have against that range, 37%, times the chance this person calls, right? So 12% times 37% times 1325, 59.3 chips. That's if you win. And you go through this for each person. This automatically does it. I put the formula in. This time you win 1425. It happens 35% of the time. That's how much you win against this range. Times 10.83%, etc., 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 etc. Now, what about the hands where you lose? Those other showdowns where you lose. Well, it's likewise. You start with the chance this guy calls, I2, times 1 minus J2. In other words, if the J column is your equity in against that range, 1 minus that is the other guy's equity. So 63% of the time times 12% times the amount you lose, the 11,000. Likewise, over here, chance he calls times 1 minus this equity times times what you lose, be 11. It's 1,000. So you add up total amount from wins, total amount from losses, and you get a loss of 133 chips from the times that he calls. So that shows up over here. So what you have is very simply 157 wins from folds, 133 losses from calls. So your net from shoving is 23. And your net gain from shoving is 23 as well, because, I mean, if you fold, you don't lose anything. You're still left with 1,000. And so there you are. You have about break even. Okay. However, this ignores something that we all instinctively knew was correct, but we weren't exactly sure how to deal with it. See, in this hand, if we do not do anything, if we fold, do we really have 1,000 chips? Because the very next hand, 200 chips, poof, before you even get to play a hand. 25 more chips, poof. You don't even get a chance to play a hand. So we didn't even penalize him for the fact that he has to pay the big blinds in the next hand, right? So we have to do that. How? Well, put another chart, another tab here, and everything over here came over the same. All of the equities, all the inputs came the same, except we have to make some adjustment for the loss of chips. But how much of an adjustment? Now, we talked about this in the chat, and I was interested to hear what people's opinions are. And I heard some I heard some interesting opinions. One person adamantly suggested that you don't penalize him at all because we can't think about the next hand yet. All we're thinking about is this hand. So it's not fair to penalize him at all, and you got to give him 1,000. But instinctively, you know that's not true, right? Because if you shove from the button, or excuse me, if you fold from the button with 1,000 chips, you know instinctively you're going to have a better shot the next hand because you're going to actually have 975 to work with as opposed to 200 just disappearing. So we dismissed that. And then a lot of people went the other extreme and suggested that we deduct 2.25 and make that the amount that they lose if they fold, right? Because if you fold and now you have, if you had 1,000 and now you fold, 200 is gone, making it 800, and another 25 is gone from another ante, making it 70-75. So you want to lose like maybe 225 or something like that. Okay. Now, the truth of the matter is in the middle. See, you think about this. If you put chips in the pot pre-flop, okay? If you put chips in the pot pre-flop, there's 525. That money's gone, all right? It's on. It's out there. But you have some piece of it, right? Like if you're in the big blind and there's 525 in the middle, it's not as if you have none of it. You have some equity in it. So in addition, so although you do have to put 225, take 225 away from your resulting equity if you fold, you do have to have some kind of add back. You do have some equity in that pot. So how do you determine that? Well, fortunately, we have the Hold'em resources on which the kinds of the charts were based that kind of can just determine this for us. What I did was I inputted all this data into the next hand, like presuming that he did fold and he's got 1,000. What this actually tells you is what his equity is in the pot, right? What his equity is on the average. So what you do is you add up all of these stacks. So 5,000 times 8 is 40, plus 1 is 41,000. And you multiply that by that 0.0222, and you actually get 9, 10, 20. Okay? So his actual resulting equity in the hand, oops, his actual resulting equity in the hand is 9, 10, 20. Just put that in manually for a second. So essentially what the add back is 9, 10, 20 minus 775. So let's do that. 9, 10, 20 minus 775. So he gets 135.20 add back. We don't need the percentage of equity in the next pot. Okay. So you see what we did there? We calculated that he's got really 9, 10 of equity, not 775. So the add back is 135.20. So how does that impact things? Well, now, whereas originally we had him losing 0 if he folded, now, if he folds, he get dinged, right? Now you lose 89.8 chips, right? You're 225 plus minus your add back of 135. So now, if you lose, you get punished. I mean, if you fold, you get punished. So what that impacts is, look at this. Where originally we were going to win 525 if we steal. Not anymore, because now if we steal, we lose that 89.8, right? Now we only win 435 if we steal. Okay? Which impacts your wins from folds, right? 130 from 157, okay? Which impacts everything. Now, you see, I wonder if you could see this, but you see the net result, how it changes when you add in the big blind here. Where it used to be your net from shoving was, your gain was 23. Okay. Now, if you factor in that, you have the big blind to deal with, your net gain goes up to 65, right? It's more important for you to shove. Now, when I saw that, the first thing that came to my mind is that, well, I thought that it would be a little greater than that. If we're going to penalize somebody a full, how much was it? 525, a full 97 chips or whatever that is, 89 chips, a full 10% of your stack for folding. I mean, you should probably be shoving so much wider. Well, why? So why is it not that much of a difference? Well, what's interesting about it is you got to think about this. We only think that paying the big blind and antes and that impact affects you the times that you fold. But no. In other words, if you shove, and let's just say that they fold to you and you get to steal, it's not as if you don't have to pay the big blind the next hand anyway, right? It's just that you're richer. You still have to ding yourself even if you win, right? So that's what we were saying. So it's not just that if you fold, you get dinged, but it's also if you're successful in your steal, you get dinged. And even more, not more important, but also, remember all these win if you win business from when we didn't have to worry about the big blind? Well, you know what? When you shove, even if you do win the pot, hooray, we double up. It's not as if you don't have to pay the big blind. The impact of the big blind and ante still is going to affect your resulting equity, even if you double through. It's just not going to affect you as much as a percentage of your stack. So it's not as if this big blind business only affects you when you steal, right? Or it's not as if it only affects you when you fold. It affects you when you steal, and it affects you when you double through. So all right, so that made sense. That made a lot of sense. But then I started thinking something else. Well, if the big blind and the impact of the big blind is going to be added back, or is going to be is going to you're going to get dinged for it regardless of what happens, well, now I'm back to my original problem: is why should there be a difference at all? Why should there be a difference between your gain from shoving when you don't consider the big blind as opposed to when you do consider the big blind being paid? Why should there be a difference if it affects both scenarios? Well, here's the answer. The reason why it matters is that there is one very important variation where the payment of the big blind is not going to matter. And that is the variation where you go broke, right? If you get called, which is going to happen 70% of the time, and you lose, the bad news is you're out. But the good news mathematically is you don't have to pay the big blind, right? So that's the one variation where adding back the big blind is going to tip the scales, and it's a really big variation. And that is why there is going to be a difference between the between your equity shoving when you don't consider the big blind versus your equity when you do consider the big blind. Okay. So what is it? So what is your break even? If you want to, if you enter these ranges, right? What is the break even? Well, you know what? I can't give that to you. All right. I'll look here, and that here, and now, like given these equities, it's, you have a decent size edge in gaining from shoving. But I do want to throw in two other common sense things that you want to consider, even if you're getting close to break even. Is this one of them? Is again, the thing we talk about all the time: the strength of the tournament, right? Like if this is a tournament where you feel you have a really strong edge, then you want to opt for the least, for not a high variance play. So if this were right on the break even, I would not shove in a very easy tournament. And the other thing that this does not take into consideration, which is just way too hard mathematically to do, especially in the short amount of time here, is the impact of overcalls. Like if you shove, the hijack calls you, and then somebody else wakes up with a beast behind him, where you'll have like no equity, okay, against both guys. So I think that it's fair to say that even just the impact of the overcalls would indicate that you need to have a, I don't want to quantify it, but a decent size edge from shoving. Now, again, if you only have 1,000 chips, 65 chips is not that bad. Okay, so this is kind of a decent size edge. So if you do have these types of equities, then you can go ahead and shove. All right, you want to throw it in here. What's a hand that you might think that you'd want to shove, like a borderline hand? Let's run one. All right, we'll run one. Let's run 5-6 suited. Okay, just for the hell of it. And we'll put in the equities, and then we'll see what happens. All right. All right, let's get the poker stove up here. Let's look at 5-6 suited. Want to do 5-6 suited? All right, let's just do one. Show you how to do it, and then you can do it on your own. Okay. So we evaluate. And this is going to be 30.45%. So we'd put in here 30.45%. Okay. Well, we could cheat, and we know it's going to be in here also. Okay. Now let's change it. Let's give it the sevens and the ace 10 as suited and the ace jack for that next threshold. 31.32. Let's put that in. 31.32. Now we made it to 10.7, so let's add the hands needed to get there. 10.7. What do we add? This one, this one, this one, this one. We give this guy maybe king queen. Yeah. Okay. 33.31. We'll just do it once. 33.31. You already see what's going to happen here. I mean, this is going to be a pretty big time shove. Okay. So if you don't like that one, you could do others, but let's just do this one so you just get used to it. Hijack 10.7, and you could change your assumptions if you'd like, right? 15.9 maybe, something like that. 34.78. And again, and after a while, once you see where you're headed here, you know this is like an enormous shove, so you don't even have to proceed. Okay. Now, if you want to play around, you can figure out what break evens are and things like that. But again, that's how you kind of play with this thing. All right. So conceptually, what have we learned? We've learned what we knew the whole time, that if you shove, if you're in a situation where the big blind is coming, you are going to have to shove a little wider than you normally would, because the big blind does have to be paid the next hand. And the ante does have to be paid the next hand, so there is some negative effect of that. So you do have to shove a little wider than you might otherwise if you just, analyzed it normally. And the other thing, again, we also learned, we talked about at least, the reason for that is because you actually gain in a weird way on the variations where you lose and then you bust out. And just again, to re-review, you have to make other adjustments on top of that, being for your skill level and also for the adjustments of overcalls. So when you do run these things, if there is a little bit of an edge, then it's going to be, then it's probably not going to be worth shoving. Okay. Okay, I guess that's it. This was a lot of math, but again, I encourage you to go ahead and play around with this if you'd like. And there is something I do want to stress before you go too crazy with this. And I've discussed this in chat, I've discussed this with everybody. This is not a situation where you should be happy to be in. In other words, I see this all the time, especially in people that used to play sit and goes and things like that, is people, they start off the turn with 100 big blinds, they lose a hand, they get down to 40 big blinds. And some people in their heads, they almost wish they had 20 big blinds, because then they know they could play perfectly. And they know when to reshove and they know everything. But remember, these short stack skills it's kind of like survival skills. There's skills that you really don't ever want to have to use. Okay. It's like the analogies I've discussed all the time, like the football analogies, American football, where a team thinks they're so great because they have an awesome goal line defense. Well, I mean, great. I mean, the thing is it's nice that for all those times you let the team get down to the 1 yard line, that you don't let them in too often. But I promise you this, if you're a football team that plays an entire season out of the shadow of its own goal line, or the shadow of its own end zone, you're going to lose. Okay. Like in backgammon, if you're a real good backgame player, that means that you're always playing a back game, which means you're losing. Okay. And likewise, if you find yourself in these situations too often, there's something wrong with the rest of your game. Okay. But if you do get in these situations, you may as well play them correctly. Okay. Because if you If you screw these up, you're out, right? If you screw up a post flop C bet decision when you're 400 big blinds deep, big deal. But if you screw this up, you're going to be out, or worse, or you're going to not shove when you're supposed to, and basically just throw your entire equity in the garbage can. So again, don't be so excited when you have to use this stuff, but at least know that you do have the tools to survive and to analyze these things if you do get in those situations. All right, guys. I hope that wasn't too much. Try to keep it as easy as possible. And that's it. Till next time, this is Sheets, and good luck.